Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Survivors of the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein introduced Virginia's law at a press conference in Washington. Iran warns of a destructive influence on diplomacy ahead of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington tomorrow. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman meets Prince William on his first official visit to Saudi Arabia. Survivors of late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and Democratic lawmakers are putting forward Virginia's law at the U.S. Capitol building today. It comes after a video of Ghislaine Maxwell, the convicted associate of Epstein, has been released. It shows her refusing to answer questions from the U.S. House Oversight Committee. Take a look.
At any point during your personal relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, were you aware that Mr. Epstein was sexually abusing minors and adult women?
I would like to answer your question, but on the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer this question and any related questions. My habeas petition is pending in the Southern District of New York. I therefore invoke my right to silence under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Have you ever facilitated the sexual abuse of any minor or adult woman by Mr. Epstein?
I invoke my Fifth Amendment right to silence.
We can now go live to London to speak to the deputy editor of The Spectator, Freddy Gray. Freddy, thank you so much for joining me. First of all, we've just seen there Ghislaine Maxwell declining to answer questions from lawmakers as she continues to appeal for clemency. Was this a brazen attempt by Maxwell to have Trump end her prison sentence?
I think that's clearly the legal strategy. Her legal team have made it quite clear that she can't talk unless she's granted clemency. I think one can call it brazen, perhaps it is. There is also an interesting other side to the Ghislaine story, though, which is that her initial conviction was based on quite a lot of evidence that is hotly disputed. And I've interviewed her brother quite a few times, who's a very honourable gentleman, it seems to me. And he's very adamant that Ghislaine Maxwell has actually been the victim of a great misjustice or injustice here. And just saying that is a very controversial thing to say. But I would encourage your viewers to kind of look back over the case and all of the in-depth reporting that's happened over it. Because, you know, it's been said quite a lot, but it is true that there are a lot of very powerful people involved in this, a lot of very powerful men. And the one person who's in jail at the moment as a result of Jeffrey Epstein is a woman. And also, the only people who have suffered in terms of careers and reputations at the moment, really suffered, are British people. So because of their association with Jeffrey Epstein. You have Lord Mandelson, no longer, well, he'll no longer in the House of Lords anyway, Peter Mandelson, former ambassador to the US. You have the former Prince Andrew, no longer a prince. And of course, you have Ghislaine Maxwell. So, I mean, I do think it does seem to be a rather cynical attempt to plea for clemency. Trump himself has said nobody has approached him about this. I wonder if anyone will approach him about it now. And if he is going to give her clemency, will he wait till it's the very end of his term? Or will he do so now? Because she seems to be suggesting she can exonerate Trump, or her legal team certainly seem to be suggesting that. She's not suggesting anything, as the video you just played suggests.
Freddy, it's so interesting because, as you did just tell me, it seems to be people from the UK that have really fallen on the sword when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein. We haven't seen the same ripple effect over in the US from the Epstein files and the names that have appeared. Why do you think that is the case? Because members of the US Congress have had an opportunity to even view some of the Epstein files without the blacked out sections in the documents that were made available to the public.
Well, I think, this story has come from the American Department of Justice. And I do think that the reckoning for the various American figures will at some stage have to come. We're going to have Bill Clinton is going to have to testify in front of Congress. I mean, his relationship, if you listen to Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyers, they're saying not only will their evidence exonerate Trump, but it will also exonerate Bill Clinton. But there is nonetheless, people who have been redacted in these files. And there's a lot of people who have seen, or not a lot, there is a few people, including some congressmen yesterday on Capitol Hill, who saw some of the names and have said there's no need for these names to be withheld. We need maximum transparency here. And the excuse is always national security, that these names must be withheld for reasons of national security. But that tends to be quite a good blanket for powerful people or powerful groups and institutions to say this evidence must be withdrawn because it's against the national interest, when actually very often it's really a case of covering themselves because it's embarrassing or humiliating or incriminating.
And I guess the difficult part really is because people were named in the Epstein files, it doesn't mean that they were involved in any illicit activity that took place on Epstein's island or within the realms of Epstein that was organized by himself. So it's really a minefield looking at these Epstein files, isn't it? Because we talk about what Ghislaine Maxwell's brothers said to you, and it's so difficult to decipher what is actually true and what's not.
Well, yes, and I think within the world that Epstein was operating in, there were links to intelligence. And the world of intelligence is obviously very dark, and it deals in truth and counter-truth and post-truth rumors. So quite often things are put about in circulation in those worlds that are either made up or they are suggesting that something might be coming, and you as an elite person who happens to be emailing Jeffrey Epstein have access to this knowledge. But is that knowledge true, or is it put in by intelligence agencies to cause something? It's a whole sort of warren of misinformation. And a lot of conspiracy theorists, and I'm not sure this is entirely wild as an idea, think that it's all been sort of dumped at the same time in order to sow maximum confusion, because there are so many different elements here. And it's so hard for your average person just sort of trying to figure out what's going on by watching the news, reading the news, or even looking through these emails themselves. It's so hard for them to figure out where the actual conspiracy lies. The truth, I think, as much as we can make out, is that for a certain period of time, there were a group of people in what you might want to call the elite who felt themselves to be kind of above the law, and they were superior to the rest of the world. They could have, sordid lives. They could deal in government activity. They could share government secrets with each other. And they were above it because they were a sort of superior caste of people. And I think they are slowly crashing down to earth.
And what's really interesting is, Freddy, is that's what the survivors will say. The survivors of Jeffrey Epstein will say that we've been ignored, the victims of the Epstein case that we see carrying on. But I just want to bring it back to one thing, and just one thing in the UK, if we can. So we mentioned a prince, an ambassador, senior politicians are all in hot water following the revelations in these Epstein files. Keir Starmer has come out today and say, well, I'll never walk away from the mandate I was given. But he's a pretty wounded prime minister at the moment. How long do you think he could possibly hang on for?
Well, the Epstein story is fascinating in so many ways, mainly because, it's about sex, money and power, which is always fascinating to everybody. But also in the way that it just sticks to people and they can't get rid of it, even if they are not directly involved. And I think we're seeing that with Keir Starmer and his premiership at the moment. The Mandelson appointment was obviously a terrible mistake, terrible misjudgment. He was, it seems, warned pretty thoroughly that Mandelson had this relationship with Epstein and it was likely to come up, and he brushed it aside and appointed him as ambassador to Washington anyway. So I think that is going to just dog him for a while, and it will be a bit like Partygate. I don't know if your viewers remember that, but there was Partygate a few years ago after COVID, which was the idea that Boris Johnson and various people in government, while they were telling everybody else during COVID to stay locked up, they were having parties all the time. Now, that story, I think in terms of actual parties, I don't think Boris Johnson did a lot wrong. But the story just dogged him, and it led to this impression that they were living one way while the rest of the world had to live another. And Keir Starmer, again, though he's not directly linked in this story in any way, that error of judgment in appointing Mandelson is going to haunt him. And it comes at a point where he's already pretty weakened. It looks today as though the sort of imminent coup that some people were predicting over the weekend against him might have been pushed aside or pushed back a bit. But senior Labour figures are very unhappy. And so I think we're likely to see some sort of significant challenge on Keir Starmer's leadership, maybe quite soon.
Freddie Gray, who could forget Partygate? Of course, that dominated a lot of Boris Johnson's premiership towards the end. But Freddie Gray there, deputy editor of The Spectator, thank you. For more on this, I'm joined by Democratic strategist Kaivan Shroff. Kaivan, it's brilliant to have you on the show. I was obviously just talking to Freddie Gray a little bit earlier, more on the UK front, and he was saying right now, I don't know what your reaction is to it, but that it seems to be British people that have fallen on the sword when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein. We've seen the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in hot water, the US Ambassador also losing his job, Ghislaine Maxwell, also British, and she's in prison. Why hasn't the same thing happened over in the US?
Kaivan, Shroff, great to join you. I think, one of the questions here is not just about Britain. I think, we've seen the Princess of Norway come under fire here. It's really about Western values. And it's so interesting because MAGA here keeps touting these Western values. And yet it does seem like Trump has gotten a large part of the leaders here to abandon all morals, all values. And that's why we're not seeing consequences here yet. They can't even, Republican lawmakers here are being asked, do you support clemency for Maxwell? And they can't even give a clear answer on that when it's so clear that she has been involved in this. And I have to say, your last guest suggested there was some conspiracy here. What happened was Congress here passed a law forcing the release of these files after Republicans tried to stop that release. And so that's why it's all time to come out at the same time, because a law forced that release. So there isn't a lot of conspiracy there. I will say it is sort of a time past in this country where this type of scandal would have led to mass resignations. Somebody like Lutnick, who did give some testimony, but clearly was dishonest about his relationship with Epstein. Donald Trump repeatedly lied about his relationship with Epstein. So it's interesting for Maxwell to say she can exonerate all these folks. I'm an attorney as well. And think about that as a viewer, right? What piece of evidence could exonerate that somebody did not do something over a period of decades? There is no such evidence that offers that type of exoneration. So this is all a show by her and her legal team, of course.
And it's quite interesting because I just want to say Howard Lutnick was speaking today and he said, I did have lunch with Epstein because I was on a boat near his island. Was there on a family vacation. He said, I met him 3 times over 14 years. I did not have a relationship with Epstein. So Lutnick is denying a relationship with Epstein. He is coming out and saying that I did not have a relationship with Epstein. But I want to talk a little bit about the Epstein survivors because we don't speak about them enough. And they're holding a news conference right now in Washington. The Democrats have introduced the Virginia's law bill. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it's so significant, especially at this time?
Well, it's so significant. We actually just had the Super Bowl over here and they aired a really powerful ad featuring many of those survivors because so many in media here, in the political class, the elites want this story to go away. They say it's not worth investigating. They say this is all hype and there's not a lot of there. The reality is we know there were so many of these women violated at young ages, had their lives destroyed. And the fact that there still has not been accountability is such an indictment of the systems of power here that you actually have leading Democrats like Ro Khanna, but also Republicans like Thomas Massie, who worked together on the release of these files, referring to an Epstein class, this sort of global elite that seems consequence-free, and yet they can wreak havoc on all these innocent victims. So it's super important that they're continuing to push this. It's incredibly brave of these folks to keep showing up. I mean, the amount of harassment they receive from Trump supporters on this issue, death threats. It's alarming, it's scary, and it hasn't been taken seriously. And of course, our Attorney General has been part of this cover-up, Pam Bondi, who said she had that Epstein client list months ago and then refused to release any information, which again was why Congress had to act and release these files.
And it's quite interesting. You mentioned Pam Bondi, who said, yes, I had the Epstein list, and then all of a sudden didn't have the Epstein list. Kash Patel went on Joe Rogan and spoke about it. How much political traction is the handling of the Republicans when it comes to the Epstein files getting over in the US? Because as I mentioned, some of the biggest podcasters in the world are now talking about it.
You're absolutely right. And, you know, I was a delegate for Vice President Kamala Harris, and one of the big takeaways from the 2024 election was that she wasn't able to win over some of those big podcaster voices, people like Joe Rogan. But those folks are obsessed with this story. They're very focused on it. They think the Trump administration has engaged in a cover-up. They haven't been honest. And I think this is the key. These sort of conspiracy theories that your last guest mentioned, right, they thrive against whoever's in power. So, you know, I don't think that there's a lot of innocence here from what people have done and how they've reacted, because why is there so many lies and so much effort and resistance to getting this information out? But then you add the fact that Republicans control the White House, they control the Supreme Court, they control Congress, and nobody's going to believe that this is something that isn't in the control of these Republicans to actually expose and get out there if they wanted to. So a lot of these media folks, these independent podcasters, are very focused on what's the truth here, and it's really hurting the MAGA base.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there has been a lot written about how the big podcasters are questioning this. But I want to bring you to an article that has been released in the New York Times, in the New York Post, I apologize. It's actually an FBI
Big difference.
It's an FBI, I'm glad they're friends. It's an FBI document, and it reveals Trump told Palm Beach police chief, thank goodness you're stopping Epstein, and called Ghislaine Maxwell evil. And that was apparently in a 2006 phone call. What do you make of this? Because there's been so much talk about Donald Trump being named in the Epstein files. And we know Donald Trump is a real estate tycoon. He started in New York, had lots of money. That's the circles Epstein ran in, of course. And so many people have been named in these Epstein files. But it's so difficult to decipher what people knew, if it was just normal relationships, going for dinner. It's such a difficult minefield to get through.
Yeah, you know, I think reading into one email, when we know that sort of Trump and Epstein have had a back and forth relationship, sometimes they were fighting, but for decades they were friends, including well after Trump explicitly said they had cut off communication. So a blatant lie, that's highly suspect. So this one piece of evidence, but you have him lying about the birthday card that he drew and sent to Epstein with a sexual joke. Lots of tips that came out in the release of these files that are consistent and robust and detail extremely graphic behaviors by Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. So I do think that this is a media strategy to try to leak anything that makes Trump look positive, but would really put these questions to rest is, why doesn't Donald Trump show up and testify, right? I mean, Trump is mentioned 38,000 times in the Epstein files. Hillary Clinton is mentioned 0 times, and yet they're trying to have Hillary Clinton come testify about this, but not Donald Trump. By the way, Melania Trump is in the Epstein files. Melania Trump, by the way, said that she was going to sue Hunter Biden for claiming that it was Epstein that introduced her to Donald Trump. She never filed that lawsuit, and I will say in the United States, truth is an absolute defense to claims of defamation. So maybe that's why she hasn't filed the lawsuit.
So interesting. Kaivan, I feel like we could speak about this for hours, but I'm really sad to say that we're out of time. But it's been really great to have your analysis. Kaivan Shroff there. Thank you. Iran has warned of a destructive influence on diplomacy ahead of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington tomorrow. The talks are expected to focus on US negotiations with Tehran. For more on this, I'm joined by former director at IISS-America and head of Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Policy, Mark Fitzpatrick. Mark, great to have you back on the show. Thank you for joining me. So, no problem. Benjamin Netanyahu requested his visit to Washington be brought forward to tomorrow instead of next week. Why is he in such a hurry to meet Donald Trump?
I think there may be two reasons here. He wants Trump's support both for Netanyahu's foreign policies and his domestic policies. And domestic here, I am including the most recent moves on the West Bank, which Israel sees as domestic, but most people would see as foreign. Israel made some moves that are akin to annexation, de facto annexation, and he'd like Trump's support for that. Trump has, promoted themes and policies in Gaza that are inconsistent with what Israel is doing in the West Bank, but Trump probably doesn't see the difference and may well say yes to Netanyahu on the West Bank. The other issue is, of course, Iran. Netanyahu is keen that Trump not strike a diplomatic deal with Iran that leaves any power in Iran's hands, and so he'll be pressing Trump not to give in at all to Iran's demands.
And America has a large US fleet within striking distance of Iran, but Trump has really softened his tone in recent days. Does the US president want more time for diplomacy? And is this clearly frustrating Netanyahu?
Yes, I think you're right. I think he wants more time for diplomacy. He would prefer diplomacy if it could result in his demands, his goals being met. I don't think that's going to happen, but he wants to give it a try. The other thing to keep in mind here is that, what we see is not necessarily what's really happening behind the scenes. Recall last June when the United States was pursuing talks with Iran. Next fifth round had been scheduled, and even before it took place, Israel attacked. So there certainly is a possibility that what Trump, when he talks diplomacy, he may again be just trying to create a facade, and that he would use his military to attack. As you say, they're getting ready, they're getting close. They weren't quite in place yet in the last few days, but as we get closer, I think he will have them at his command and could well issue a order to attack.
And that's so interesting, Mark, because for so many months, when you read articles, people say Donald Trump might be undecided, but he might also listen to the last person who spoke to him and possibly make a decision on that. So right now he seems to have softened his stance when it comes to Iran. But do you think there's still possibly an imminent attack on the horizon after this meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu?
Yes, I thought there was an imminent attack on the horizon even before Netanyahu moved up his time to come to Washington. And what you said about Trump listening to the last voice he hears is so real. And that's another reason why Netanyahu moved up his time, in order to get into Trump's ear and talk to him and try to encourage him to, one, give a green light to Israel for a military attack, and two, for a promise for the United States to follow Israel's attack the way they did last June, and to complete whatever job that they intended last June. It was to annihilate the nuclear program. They didn't quite do that, but that's what they claimed. And this year, it might be an attack on Iran's leadership. We don't really know.
And Trump has praised very good talks with Iran, but Tehran, of course, insists only nuclear issues are on the table as they negotiate. But do you think Israel is hoping for a much broader deal that will include Iran's proxy groups, which have been significantly weakened?
Oh, absolutely. Israel wants any diplomacy with Iran to focus not just on the nuclear issue, but on Iran's support for these non-state actors, which are in a position to attack Israel, and on Iran's missiles, which did quite a bit of damage last June. So if the United States doesn't try to curb all those areas, Israel will be quite disappointed and wants to, Trump to hold the line on them. So far, we don't really know what's going on in the talks. We heard what Iran said, that they were only limited to the nuclear, but I think the United States may have also been pressing the missile and the proxy issue and just not talking about it publicly.
Mark Fitzpatrick, brilliant to have you on. Let's see how those talks do unfold tomorrow. Thank you for your time.
Thanks again.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has defended an invitation to Israeli President Isaac Herzog to visit and honour the victims of December's Bondi Beach shooting. Protesters and police clashed during a rally attended by thousands of people to mark the visit. Patrick Falk reports.
Ugly scenes in Sydney as demonstrators protest the arrival of Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Police say 27 people were arrested, including 10 allegedly for assaulting officers. 9 were later charged. Today, New South Wales State Premier Chris Minns defended the force's actions.
What you saw last night was New South Wales police being confronted multiple times by a section of that crowd intent on disturbing and disrupting police lines. Now, what we can say today that we couldn't say yesterday is that we had concurrently 7,000 mourners down at the International Convention Centre who were mourning the horrible events of the 14th of December with the President of Israel.
Just days ahead of the rally, the state introduced additional major event powers, giving police the authority to shut down areas of the city. The rules allowed demonstrators to gather, but not for them to march. Opposition Green lawmaker Abigail Boyd says she was punched while trying to leave the site.
And I told them I was a member of parliament. I couldn't go forward because there was a group of people there that I would be trampling on if I did. And then the next thing I knew, I had this force on the right of me.
What we saw last night was a monumental failure. You only have to look at what took place. The police created a literal pressure cooker. They surrounded people at Town Hall. There were no safe avenues of dispersal.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, seen here accompanying President Herzog for prayers at a synagogue earlier today, has called for calm. Pro-Palestinian groups objected to Herzog's visit, citing a UN commission last year accusing him of inciting genocide. Addressing the synagogue, he condemned the mass shooting at a Jewish religious event in December.
What we saw in Bondi, the blood-curdling act of blind hatred of Jews and hatred of Australian values, simply has no place in this country or anywhere for that matter.
The events have laid bare the deep divisions in Australia over the Gaza war and the challenge for leaders trying to balance sentiments. Patrick Falk, Al Arabiya English.
Now, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has given the heir to the British throne a private tour of the At Turaf UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of Prince William's first official visit to Saudi Arabia. His tour aims to highlight growing trade, energy and investment ties ahead of the two countries marking 100 years of diplomatic relations. William, who's a prominent environmental advocate, is also expected to visit the historic city of Al Ula to learn about conservation efforts. For more on this, I'm joined by Hannan Hussain, senior expert at Initiative Features. Thank you so much for joining me, Hannan. So this is Prince William's first trip to Saudi Arabia, and it's been time to mark 100 years of diplomatic relations between the two countries. How important is this visit?
I think it's difficult to understate the importance of the visit. First of all, when you look at the fact that several rounds of high-level negotiations between the finance ministers, as well as different tracks on the economy and the diversification front, have followed we've seen that the momentum is in place to advance this at the highest level. We also do see that part of the diplomatic symbolism also owes to UK's recognition of Saudi Arabia as one of its leading strategic partners in the region. We've seen growing focus on economic integration also gather pace. UK and Saudi Arabia alone have accumulated trade volume of nearly 17 billion pounds last year. And that comes as, you've also seen high-level negotiation happen in 2025, which focused on, for example, advancing cooperation along fintech and also high-growth sectors. So I think this visit at this particular time sends one particular signal on diplomatic symbolism kind of strengthening between these two countries. At the same time, UK's willingness to open up new avenues of cooperation with Saudi Arabia at a time when its own Vision 2030 gathers a lot of steam and regional traction going forward.
And it's also widely expected that Prince William's visit will help Britain agree a free trade agreement with the GCC. Can he use his royal magic to get this deal over the line, which has been in the making for almost 4 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the recognition on that front would be that it's high time to kind of seal the deal in a way that is mutually acceptable. I think Saudi Arabia and the UK's efforts going into those multi-year negotiations have been well demonstrated. But I think the tone is now set for both countries to, for example, chart a roadmap which looks for integration. I think the GCC-UK agreement, once materializing, it can serve as an important proof point. And I think the part of my optimism stems from the UK's recent bilateral dialogues as well, in which the focus on economy and trade has been bilateral, but there's a growing openness to, for example, increase market access as well, kind of create these very conducive conditions for exporters on both sides to benefit from Middle East export flow, something where Saudi Arabia has a vantage point. And so I think when you look at those considerations at this point in time, I think this particular visit at the highest level, Prince William can obviously use his personal aura as well to kind of put the seals on this going forward. So I think there's a lot of optimism on that front, yeah.
And Prince William visited a sports complex and met young female footballers in Riyadh today. He also took part in a crossbar football challenge. What does his visit mean to the people of Saudi Arabia? We're talking about a lot of diplomacy, but what does it actually mean?
It actually means, so on a couple of fronts. So for example, when you look at the sports front, that's one particular sector which had gained priority recognition in the 2025 exchange, part of their strategic dialogue as well. So there was a lot of focus on expanding into that sector. So I think when you look at sports diplomacy as a vehicle for people-to-people contacts, for great economic leverage, I think that's the point where the UK's existing toehold on the sports front and Saudi Arabia's preparation for the 2034 World Cup is something which creates this ecosystem of a sports economy where I think bringing in more industries into play and people's aspirations going forward, we talk about women empowerment as well. So all those mixes coming in can create a broader new avenue for multi-year growth, something which I think would have an economic case on both fronts as well. When you look at the people-to-people contacts, I think on that front, Prince William also engaged with Saudi women who were part of, sports and the FIFA's preparations going forward. So I think when you look at those fronts, Saudi Arabia's existing proof point in making its sports offerings, A, internationally lucrative, and B, an ecosystem of economic growth is something which the UK is potently positioned to contribute to. So I think there's a lot of confidence on that front for a sports economy to be built, and part of the context we're focused on that.
And a royal source has said the prince enjoyed an evening with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And I was just wondering, both princes are around the same age, maybe William's about 4 years older. And how important is it for both of these men to form this working relationship and focus on the future together? Because one day they will both be in those big positions of power.
Absolutely. It's at the edge of power, and that equilibrium applies on both fronts. So I think, first of all, it kind of prepares the ground for what tangible leadership will look like on the bilateral front. We know that personal contacts and personal relationships play a big role in setting the direction for an enduring path of foreign policy. I think with the UK and Saudi Arabia, both their respective leaders being at the helm of power and looking to advance aspirations, I think it sets a very potent direction for where things have to go. I think one of the standout elements of this particular visit is the broad expanse of multi-sector cooperation that is on display. I think we've seen that during as part of the visits before, but I think the altitude of the visit at this point in time and the level of sectors that we're looking to integrate into could broadly benefit from a personal rapport and symbolism something which I think will be demonstrated at the luncheon as well, and also at the latter leg of this 3-day visit.
Hannan, Hussain, it was brilliant to have you on. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
You're welcome.
Now, Bangladesh is preparing for a high-stakes election on the 12th of February, the first in nearly 2 decades without Sheikh Hasina or Khalida Zia. With fears of unrest and political violence, attention now on whether security forces and the army can keep the vote peaceful and neutral. Darshan Dalal has this report.
Bangladesh is preparing for an election unlike any other in its recent history. After years of disputed polls and opposition boycotts, this vote is being billed as the country's first genuinely competitive election since 2008, but also one of its most volatile. Security has become the central concern. The interim government has deployed police, paramilitary forces, and thousands of army personnel across the country, particularly in politically sensitive districts and former ruling party strongholds. Analysts warn the risk is not just election day violence, but what comes before and after.
And many Bangladeshis haven't had the chance to vote for the past 17 years. So I think there's a lot of excitement around the election, people having the opportunity to vote again. I mean, if you think about it, someone in their early 30s may not have ever voted in a competitive election before. So that excitement's definitely there. But I think there is uncertainty as to what will come next.
That uncertainty is feeding into several potential flashpoints. Experts point to clashes between rival party supporters, attempts to deliberately disrupt the vote, and internal fighting within parties themselves.
Conflict between candidates or supporters of candidates who are participating in the election. So that would principally be between BNP supporters and Jamaat supporters in constituencies that are considered in play where there's going to be a very competitive election.
The infighting within the Bangladesh Nationalist Party has already been one of the deadliest sources of political violence since the interim government took power after Sheikh Hasina's ouster. At the same time, minorities and supporters of the banned Awami League fear they could be targeted or even detained if they turn up to vote.
That the violence has not necessarily peaked that much if you compare with the other elections. So I think that is a great signal.
That places enormous pressure on Bangladesh's security forces, particularly the army. Since August 2024, when Hasina fled the country, the military has been deployed nationwide to backstop a weakened police force. Its neutrality is now seen as decisive.
At that point, the army chief, had the choice whether he wanted to take power himself or come up with another way forward for the country. And I think he made a wise decision, not to take power.
For voters, trust in that neutrality may determine turnout and acceptance of the result. Analysts warn that if any major bloc rejects the outcome, Bangladesh could face post-election unrest, regardless of who wins.
They must also make sure at the same time, the political parties do not necessarily engage in violent conflicts and the post-election violence. I think those are the areas that they need to be very careful about.
With millions heading to the polls, Bangladesh's security forces face a defining test, not just to keep the order, but to safeguard credibility in a vote many see as a turning point for the country's fragile democracy. Darshan Dalal, Arabiya English.
A reminder of our top stories. Survivors of the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein introduced Virginia's law at a press conference in Washington. Iran warns of a decisive influence on diplomacy ahead of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington tomorrow. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman meets Prince William on his first official visit to Saudi Arabia. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, follow us on X. We'll be back in a couple of hours with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you for watching.